Simon, I remember reading there was a little article that you wrote in a volume called Unashamed Workman, and an insight that you gave about preaching, I think you called it a conviction, is that a lot of pastoral care happens in preaching or from the pulpit. Can you speak a little bit more into that? What are you thinking about when you talk about that as a conviction?
Yeah. I think what I meant is that preaching, one of the great privileges of preaching is that you're speaking to the most number of people at the same time. And you're helping people to understand the truth of God, which liberates people, and the grace of God, which liberates people. So we shouldn't underestimate that the sermon could untangle a lot of confusion, a lot of mess in people's heads, which then filters down to the heart, the life, the marriage, the family, the work, the priorities, the values, the lifestyle, and the witness. So we can actually see a lot happen through preaching. Having said that, I wouldn't want to give the impression that a guy who's a pastor should spend all his time in a study and then just giving a talk and then disappearing, because a lot of pastoral work is done with people. And some of our best learning is done with people that we wouldn't normally mix with. So normal, good parishioners and lots of unbelievers, we learn a lot. But we tend to think of pastoral care as being often sitting with somebody who's in trouble or grieving, but preaching helps people pastorally. And I had a guy who once wrote to me to thank me for saving his marriage, and I'd never had anything to do with him. I'd never spoken to him about his marriage, never spoken to his wife, never talked to them together. But he had been listening to the grace of God. The grace of God had grabbed his heart. His heart had been wonderfully softened, and that had helped his marriage enormously.
So you mentioned one danger there would be to say, well, a lot of pastoral care happens from the pulpit, so you don't really have to spend time with people. And that's certainly something to avoid. For pastors, we need to know people. We need to be known by our people. But I suppose another danger would be to spend time with people for fodder for preaching. Would you say that that's also maybe a danger? You wouldn't want people to come think, well, if I share something with my pastor, he may just use that in his preaching. Would you say that that's also possible? Or?
Well, you certainly should never use something that is confidential or likely to be hurtful or painful. That would be very irresponsible. But it would be possible to say in a sermon. I was talking to somebody this week, and they were sensing that the Christian life was difficult for this reason and this reason. And I tried to share with them this and this, in which case their experience is a help to the rest of the congregation. But we'd need to be very careful not to abuse people's confidences, and also not to imagine that the conversation you've had through the week is all over the seats in the church. The fact that you've gone to meet with somebody who is being fairly reckless and consumed with business and money doesn't mean that you should cane everybody with that issue the next Sunday.
That makes a lot of sense. And so I suppose meeting with people does help you speak into the variety of issues that are happening in your church, always being careful of the need for confidentiality and that kind of stuff.
You learn a lot from those visits. And somebody has said, that in every person listening there's a great deal of sadness. And there is a great deal of sadness, and sometimes you only discover what people have actually been through or are going through by sitting and talking with them.
I recently heard somebody on a podcast talking about how a lot of preaching is challenge driven. A lot of preachers are giving people a challenge. And this particular preacher was saying that no, what they need the most is comfort, because they're convinced that they're failures and all of this. Would you sympathize with this, that caring for them maybe should rule over challenging them in preaching, or would you say nuance that in some way?
I think we do want believers to know that they are secure in Christ, and therefore if they fall and fail, that their failure is not final. We do want people, like raising our children, we want our children to know that they are secure and that their place in the home is not conditional on their performance. But having said that, there are times in the New Testament where you're just dealing with indicatives, statements, not commands. And it is a pity, I think, that some preachers will take happy statements and turn them into one more obligation, burden, command. So, you know, stereotypically, the New Testament letters mostly have indicative statement, doctrine, followed by application, command, imperative. It's not a totally neat picture, because you do get some commands in the early and you get some teaching in the later. But it is a pity, I think, when people take what is just a joyful truth and then milk it by burdening their listeners with more and more discouraging obligations. Yeah.
And one thing I've heard you say from Dick Lucas is we need to listen well to the text. And so if you're not listening well, you won't notice that what's here are truths or indicatives, and we shouldn't go turning those hastily into imperatives or commands.
Yeah, exactly.
It's good to realize. It's helpful to be students of the text and listen to the text first.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Thanks, brother.